The air around Arlington was still as stone, the kind of silence that weighed heavier than words. Tourists stood in neat rows behind the black rope line, their cameras ready, their voices hushed. At the center of it all, like a statue carved from duty itself, stood the tomb guard. His white gloves were flawless, his uniform without a crease, his face unreadable. Every click of his heels, every turn of his head, carried the weight of history, discipline sharper than any blade. But discipline was about to be tested. From the far edge of the crowd, a man in a black hoodie had been watching, his shoulders stiff, his steps uneven, his hands hidden. Nobody paid him much mind at first. Arlington often drew the quiet and the broken, but this man's eyes didn't carry sorrow. They burned with something darker. He pushed forward, slipping past murmuring families and startled veterans. Whispers rippled through the line. A woman gasped, clutching her child close. Cameras lifted higher. Security wasn't near enough yet, and the guard, he did not move. His eyes locked straight ahead, as if he were staring into eternity itself. The man stopped just a few feet away. He muttered something under his breath, too low for the crowd, but sharp enough to sting. And then, in one sudden motion, his hand came out from under the hoodie. In his grip glinted a knife. The crowd froze. Gasps broke the silence like shattering glass. Some shouted for help, others ducked away. But the guard did not flinch. His rifle rested on his shoulder, his posture unbroken, his jaw clenched, but his eyes, they never shifted. Then it happened. The man's arm snapped forward, sending the blade flying. It cut the air with a hiss, a streak of steel aimed straight for the guard's chest. Time seemed to slow. Children screamed. Veterans surged forward. Phones captured every frame. To the untrained eye, it looked certain. This time, even the guard would fall, but fate or something greater intervened. The knife never reached its target. Inches before striking, the steel jerked off course, as if knocked aside by an invisible hand. It clattered harmlessly onto the stone path, spinning to a stop at the guard's boots. The crowd erupted in disbelief. Some swore they had seen a flick of the guard's arm. Others whispered of divine protection. Through it all, the guard remained exactly where he was, frozen, unbroken, his gaze fixed forward, as if to say, no man, no blade, no threat can pierce honor. The knife still lay on the stone, glinting beneath the heavy sun, but the world around it seemed to hold its breath. Security rushed forward, the crowd pressed back, and the attackers' shouts blurred into chaos. Yet through it all, the guard did not break his stance. His eyes were steady, his chest lifted, his rifle held as though nothing at all had happened. For the people watching, it was a miracle, but for the guard himself, it was something deeper and unshakable vow he had carried for years. Long before he ever put on the uniform of the old guard, he had carried another one, the weight of war. He had been a soldier overseas, a young man with dreams bigger than his small hometown, stepping into battle with nothing but courage and the hope of coming back alive. He had fought in sand and heat, where the air smelled of dust and fire, where each sunrise meant another day of surviving. He had seen friends laugh in the morning and be gone by sundown. He had seen one in particular, a brother in arms he had trusted more than anyone, cut down in an ambush that neither of them had seen coming. That loss was a scar deeper than any wound on the body. It was the memory that lived in his chest every time he breathed. When the war ended for him, when his boots touched American soil again, he could have walked away. Many did. Some turned bitter, some broke apart in silence, but he chose something different. He searched for a way to honor the fallen, a way to make his life a standing tribute to the ones who could no longer stand. That path led him here, to Arlington, to the tomb of the unknown soldier, place where silence was not emptiness, but reverence, where stillness spoke louder than any words. Becoming a guard was not easy. Few men and women passed the test. Every detail mattered: shoes polished to glass, uniforms pressed to perfection, steps measured to fractions of inches. He trained through nights where failure was a whisper away, pushing until discipline became second nature. For him, it was never just about ceremony. It was about redemption. Each silent hour he stood at the tomb was another promise to his fallen brothers and sisters. I will not forget you. I will carry your honor forward. And yet, while the guard carried his past like a medal etched in pain, the man who had just thrown the knife carried something darker. He had once been seen in different circles, dressed not in a hoodie but in sharp suits, shaking hands with men who wore power like armor. Once upon a time, he was a name whispered in courtrooms, a local politician who clawed his way up with charm and force. But his rise was not built on honesty. It was built on cutting corners, silencing rivals, and twisting the truth until it bent in his favor. When his corruption finally surfaced, When recordings and files stripped away the polished mask he wore, his world collapsed. He lost his seat, his money, his reputation. To the public, he was disgraced, but to himself, he was a man betrayed, humiliated, left to rot while the world moved on. He hated everything that reminded him of honor, of discipline, of the ideals he could never live up to. That hatred festered, turning into something wild. And when he came to Arlington that day, it was not as a mourner or a visitor, it was as a man looking for someone to destroy. The place he chose was no accident. Arlington was a ground of sacred weight. Every stone marked a life given, every blade of grass held history. Generals rested here beside privates, names known and unknown carved into silence. The tomb itself was more than marble. It was a vow to every soldier who never made it home, a reminder that even in anonymity, sacrifice would not be forgotten. Tourists walked its paths, veterans stood with trembling hands at its edges. Children asked questions in whispers. To strike at this place was to strike at the very soul of memory. That was why the crowd had been so unsettled even before the knife flew. Veterans in their faded caps recognized the danger before others did. Mothers shielded their children without knowing why. Cameras captured not just the guard but the tension of history pressing in on the moment. Everyone understood, in some unspoken way, that Arlington was not a place for violence. It was a place where the living honored the dead, and yet violence had broken through anyway. The attacker had thought the guard would react like any man, that he would flinch, step aside, stumble under the suddenness of danger, but he underestimated what years of discipline could do. The guard had been trained not just in ceremony but in control. He had learned to breathe through pain, to stand through storms, to silence every instinct of fear. Even when the steel cut the air toward him, he did not move. That was the power of the tomb guard, to stand not as an individual, but as a living symbol. Now, as the crowd reeled from what they had just seen, two stories silently clashed in the open air. On one side stood the guard, forged by loss but rebuilt through duty. On the other crouched the attacker, a man once lifted by lies but now broken by his own rage. Between them lay the knife, harmless now, its edge dulled not by metal but by the unyielding will of a man who had refused to move. The world was about to witness, more than a confrontation, it was about to witness what happens when bitterness meets honor, when chaos tests tradition, and when one man's hatred collides with another's vow. And for those who stood in the crowd that day, what came next would be burned into their memory forever. The sound of boots thundered against the stone as security finally closed in. Two officers pinned the attacker to the ground, his arms wrenched behind his back, the knife kicked away. He shouted curses, his face twisted with rage, his words spitting venom at the guard who still hadn't moved. The crowd leaned in, phones lifted, recording every second. Veterans clenched their jaws, mothers held their children tighter, and somewhere in the back a teenager whispered. He didn't even blink. The air buzzed with disbelief, fear and awe all at once. The guard, though, was as still as ever. His rifle remained steady on his shoulder, his eyes fixed straight ahead. To anyone who didn't know better, it might have seemed like indifference, but those who understood, the veterans, the officers, even the child who peeked around his mother's waist, knew this was not emptiness. It was discipline. It was defiance. It was a man refusing to surrender dignity even when chaos raged inches away. The attacker's shouts grew louder. "You think you're better than us. You think standing still makes you a hero." His voice cracked with fury as he writhed under the grip of the officers. He spat toward the guard, his words bouncing between rage and desperation. The crowd booed him, some yelling for silence, others demanding he be dragged out immediately. But still, the guard did not react. Not a flicker of an eye, not the twitch of a hand. This unshaken silence drove the man mad. Even pinned down, his insults escalated. He barked about corrupt governments, about forgotten promises, about how all soldiers were just puppets in uniforms. Each word was meant to cut, to break through the armor of discipline. But the words fell like stones thrown against a mountain, loud, violent, and utterly useless. And yet within the crowd, reactions fractured. Some were furious, especially the veterans, whose lives had been shaped by the same ideals the guard now embodied. Their fists clenched, eyes burning, one or two even stepping forward until security motioned them back. But others looked unsettled, unsure. A few younger onlookers whispered that maybe the man had a point, that maybe all this silence was just blind obedience. Their words didn't rise above the gasps and shouts, but they lingered like an echo, proof that chaos always seeks cracks in certainty. Cameras zoomed in closer. Reporters who had been on site for a human interest piece about the tomb now found themselves at the center of breaking news. Microphones shoved forward, lenses captured every frozen detail of the guard's face. They waited for him to break, for him to lash out, for even the smallest twitch of anger. But he gave them nothing. He stood in perfect silence, a statue against the storm. Minutes dragged on like hours. The officers struggled to haul the attacker up. He thrashed with surprising strength, dragging the spectacle longer than anyone wanted. Each time he spat an insult or twisted against the cuffs. The crowd grew louder. Tension swelled like a drumbeat that refused to end. And then, just when it seemed order was finally being restored, the unexpected happened. The attacker wrenched himself free from one officer's grip. It wasn't enough to escape, but it was enough to stagger forward, just a step closer to the guard. In that heartbeat of freedom, he lunged out with a knife this time, but with words sharp as any blade. He screamed at the guard, "You're a coward, hiding in silence. Look at me when I talk to you. Look at me." The sound ricocheted through the air, a demand louder than the shouts of the crowd. The guard's eyes, locked forward with military precision, did not meet his. His jaw tightened, but his stance did not shift. And in that refusal, in that denial of recognition, the man found himself powerless. Nothing stung more than being invisible, especially to the one you sought to destroy. The crowd gasped at the scene. Children buried their faces against their parents. Reporters whispered to each other, their cameras rolling. A veteran in the front row muttered, "That's how you do it. That's how you win without a fist." But the attacker wasn't done. Dragged back down by security, his voice cracked with desperation now. He shouted about lies, about betrayal, about how soldiers like the guard were wasting their lives protecting ghosts. The venom was still there, but underneath it was something raw, emptiness that revealed itself in every word. His tirade wasn't just against the guard, it was against the world, against the ideals he could never uphold, against the honor he could never claim. The escalation wasn't only about the man's rage, it was about the way the moment grew heavier for everyone present. Children saw a symbol of fearlessness. Veterans saw a reflection of the discipline they once carried. Parents saw a lesson in dignity. And the world, through cameras and recordings that would soon go viral, saw the living embodiment of strength through silence. But silence is not easy. Inside the guard's chest, his heart pounded like a drum. Memories flickered the desert sand, the crack of gunfire, the face of his fallen friend. Every insult hurled at him could have pierced like shrapnel if he let it. But he had learned long ago that stillness was its own kind of weapon. Every second he refused to react was another victory, another moment where chaos could not win. The tension stretched further still. The crowd grew restless. Some shouted encouragement toward the guard, their voices trembling with pride. Others demanded the attacker be silenced once and for all. Yet through the noise, one thing became clear. The guard's calm presence had shifted the balance. Where moments earlier panic had ruled, now a strange order took hold. The people, once afraid, now drew strength from the very man who had not moved an inch. But the escalation had not reached its peak. For the attacker, silence was worse than chains. His body pinned, his arms bound, he thrashed again and again, screaming louder, his words devolving into incoherent rage. He wanted the guard to fall, to flinch, to answer back anything, to prove that he had power left. But with every second of stillness, his power drained away, leaving him smaller, weaker, and more broken in the eyes of the crowd. By now, the officers had him almost under control. His shouts grew hoarse, his fight weaker, but still his eyes burned. And in those eyes, locked on the guard, the final insult was forming. He drew in a breath, ready to unleash something that would cut deeper than before, something meant to wound the soul rather than the body. The crowd leaned in, the silence before the storm pressing down like weight on their chests. And just as the man opened his mouth to speak, the guard shifted. Not a step, not a break, but the slow, deliberate lowering of his rifle from his shoulder to his side. The movement was measured, precise, and silent, and it froze everyone where they stood. The escalation had reached its peak. Chaos had tried every weapon, violence, insults, rage, and still the guard stood unbroken. Now, with one silent gesture, he was about to turn the tide. The attacker's chest heaved, his face red with fury and humiliation, as officers held him firm. But the man's eyes never left the guard. Every shred of dignity he had left, every ounce of anger was aimed at one target, the living symbol of discipline before him. The crowd leaned forward, sensing that the moment was about to shift, that the tension which had stretched unbearably long was about to snap. Then it happened. The attacker, with one final desperate surge, lashed out. He pushed against the officer holding him, leaning just enough to jerk his body forward. His hand, no longer gripping a knife, made contact not violently, but enough to tap the guard's shoulder, a touch laden with insult and provocation. The crowd collectively gasped. Mothers covered their children's eyes. Veterans shifted, their fists clenching, their jaws tightening as if they themselves had been struck. Reporters froze, cameras trembling in their hands. The guard did not flinch. He did not even blink. His face remained perfectly neutral, his posture impeccable. To the untrained eye, it looked as though nothing had happened, but in truth, the moment contained a universe of tension. Inside, the guard's mind raced with every principle he had learned, every lesson carved into him by years of service. He knew instinctively that reacting too soon could escalate the situation into something dangerous. Yet he also knew that inaction could not equal passivity. This required precision, mental, physical, moral. The attacker, sensing he had gotten a rise, or at least expecting it, shouted again, his voice slicing through the air. "You think you're untouchable. You think silence makes you strong. I'll make sure the world sees you for what you really are." His words were venomous, but hollow. The crowd recoiled from the volume, the aggression, the sheer audacity. Children whimpered, some hiding behind parents, others peering from fingertips. Veterans whispered to one another, their eyes not leaving the guard, knowing that the man in uniform was about to respond in a way no one expected. And then the guard moved, not with violence, not with anger, but with a discipline so sharp it cut through the tension like a blade. His hand rose slowly, deliberately, pointing to the nearest officer. A subtle gesture, a command that carried weight beyond its simplicity. The officer, instantly understanding, stepped forward and restrained the attacker more firmly, while the guard's gaze never wavered. But it wasn't the gesture alone that shocked everyone, it was the complete stillness that followed. The attacker struggled, shouting and twisting, but the guard's calmness seemed to press down on him. The silence became a weapon more powerful than any shout. The crowd felt it, an invisible pressure that drained the man of confidence and resolve. He realized, slowly, that every attempt to provoke a reaction had failed. Every insult, every lunge, every scream had bounced off an unyielding wall of discipline. The longer he struggled, the smaller he seemed, until the terror in his eyes replaced the rage. And then came the moment that would be etched in the memories of all present. The guard stepped forward, not aggressively, but measured, precise, and deliberate. Each step was calculated, the sound of polished boots on stone echoing like a drumbeat. The crowd held its collective breath. The attacker's eyes widened, his chest heaving with fear and disbelief. He expected retaliation, a strike, a verbal condemnation, but none came. Instead, the guard stopped just a few feet away, close enough to dominate the space, yet still under complete control. He raised one hand, not in anger, not in threat, but in a slow, solemn salute. The crowd gasped. Even the officers paused, caught in awe at the perfection of the gesture. The attacker's defiance faltered. The fire in his eyes dimmed, replaced by the recognition that he was facing someone far beyond his comprehension, someone who wielded discipline like a weapon stronger than any blade or shout. The silence stretched. It was absolute, yet it spoke volumes. Children, veterans, tourists all understood that this was more than a confrontation. This was a demonstration of power without violence, of courage without anger, of mastery over chaos. The attacker slumped slightly, his body sagging in defeat, the words fading from his lips. Every attempt to break the guard's composure had failed. Every ounce of aggression had been absorbed by something far greater. Unwavering resolve. Finally, the crowd began to murmur, whispers of awe spreading like wildfire. The guard lowered his hand, still maintaining perfect form. The officers gently guided the attacker away, whose body now trembled, broken not physically, but morally. His eyes darted toward the guard one last time, searching for some reaction, some flaw, but there was none. Only discipline, only honor, only unshakable strength. In that single moment, the balance shifted entirely. What had begun as chaos and confrontation transformed into a spectacle of integrity. The guard had not attacked. He had not shouted. He had not even raised his weapon. He had simply stood, and in doing so, he had won, not by defeating the man physically, but by shattering his confidence, exposing his weakness, and asserting that true power is measured not in force, but in unyielding principle. The crowd erupted, not in fear but in awe. Phones clicked, cameras recorded, and eyes widened. Every person present, from the smallest child to the oldest veteran, knew they had witnessed something extraordinary. The guard had turned the tide without a single act of aggression. The attacker, once filled with rage and purpose, was now a symbol of what happens when pride meets unwavering discipline. And as the officers finally led him away, the guard returned to his post, every movement precise, every breath measured. It was as if nothing had happened, but everything had changed. The silence of Arlington had spoken louder than any scream, and the lesson was clear. True strength is shown not in chaos, but in the quiet, resolute courage to stand firm when all else collapses. The officers finally dragged the attacker fully away, his struggles reduced to weak thrashing, his voice hoarse from hours of futile yelling. The crowd watched, some in disbelief, others in awe, as the man who had tried to disrupt the sanctity of Arlington now appeared small, defeated, utterly exposed. The murmurs grew louder, and someone whispered, almost reverently, he thought he could shake the tomb guard, but he couldn't. Security placed him on the ground near the entrance, their grips firm but careful. The attacker's face twisted in fury and confusion. He searched for an answer, some reason why his assault had failed. Cameras captured every detail: his hood fallen back, his eyes wide, the lines of panic on his face. News crews streamed live, and for a moment, it seemed the world was holding its breath, waiting for the next act of chaos. But there was no next act. The guard had already returned to his post. Step by step, polished boots echoing on the stone path, he resumed his watch. The movement was calm, deliberate, and precise. Every eye in the crowd followed him, some with admiration, others with a quiet reverence that bordered on awe. He lifted his rifle slowly, adjusted his stance, and turned his gaze forward. No flinch, no fear, no hint of the tension that had nearly shattered the air moments ago. In that moment, the attacker's bravado crumbled entirely. No one came to his aid. No one shouted encouragement. No one applauded him. He had faced discipline itself and found himself powerless, arrested, humiliated, stripped of control. He was a stark contrast to the guard, whose calm authority radiated like a beacon in the crowd. Children whispered, veterans nodded quietly, and even the tourists who had arrived unaware of the confrontation felt a strange hush settle over them, as if the weight of what had just occurred pressed on every shoulder. A veteran stepped forward, his hand brushing the tomb's barrier. That man, he didn't understand, he muttered, almost to himself. Discipline isn't weakness, it's strength. Others nodded in agreement, some recording the scene, others simply watching in stunned silence. Every person present understood that they had just witnessed more than an attack. They had witnessed a lesson in honor, courage, and restraint. Meanwhile, the attacker, now under full custody, glared at the guard one last time, hoping for a reaction, a sign of vulnerability, a hint of fear. But the guard remained immovable. His expression was serene, his posture perfect. The crowd could sense the unspoken message: chaos may roar, threats may strike, but principle endures. Reporters captured every detail. Phones clicked, videos streamed live, and the footage began to circulate instantly. Across social media, comments poured in. People called it a heroic moment, a lesson in discipline, the calm before a storm of respect. The image of the guard standing perfectly still, rifle at his side, eyes forward, became iconic. It would be shared thousands, perhaps millions, of times. As the attacker was finally led away to waiting authorities. Muttering in disbelief, the guard's eyes scanned the crowd briefly. A child, no more than 8, whispered to his mother, "He's a hero." The words were quiet, almost lost in the murmur of the crowd. But for the guard, they landed with the weight of years. Every sacrifice, every hour of training, every painful memory of all of it had led to this moment of quiet triumph. The crowd slowly began to disperse, but the energy lingered. Veterans lingered for a moment longer, tipping their caps in silent acknowledgement. Mothers held their children a little tighter, some murmuring prayers of gratitude. Reporters packed up cameras and equipment, knowing they had captured something extraordinary. And at the center of it all, the guard remained unwavering, a sentinel of honor. Calm amid the storm, the knife lay forgotten on the stone, a symbol of failed aggression. The attacker's threat had been neutralized, not by violence, but by patience, discipline, and unwavering courage. Arlington had been defended, its sanctity preserved, and the crowd carried with them the memory of a man who had stood firm when others expected him to falter. For the guard, the moment was not about recognition, it was about duty, about honoring the ideals he had sworn to protect, about proving that strength often shows itself in silence, not in action. The world had watched, and the world had learned. Order had returned, chaos subdued, and the tomb of the unknown soldier remained untouched, protected, not just by the uniform, but by the unwavering principle of a man who knew what it truly meant to stand. The crowd had mostly dispersed, leaving Arlington quieter than it had been in hours. The sunlight glinted off the stone markers, casting long shadows across the grounds. The knife, once a symbol of threat, now lay forgotten, a silent reminder of what had been and what had been prevented. The guard remained at his post, motionless in stance, but alive in purpose. The weight of duty settling back onto his shoulders like an old, familiar cloak. A colonel approached, his boots echoing against the marble. He stopped a respectful distance away, raised his hand in a crisp salute, and waited until the guard acknowledged it with a slow, deliberate nod. Then the colonel returned the salute, a rare smile breaking across his weathered face. It was a smile that carried pride, understanding, and respect, not just for the uniform, but for the man inside it. Nearby, a young boy peeked from behind his mother's leg, eyes wide and shining with admiration. He whispered softly, almost as if saying it aloud would break the magic of the moment. "Hero." His mother hushed him gently, pressing a hand to his shoulder, but the guard had heard. He did not turn, did not acknowledge, and yet the boy's words lingered in the still air, a quiet reward more meaningful than any applause. The guard's mind drifted briefly to his past, the deserts he had crossed, the battles he had survived, the friends he had lost. He ran a thumb along the edge of his dog tags, worn smooth from years of touch, a constant reminder of the comrades who had not returned. One of them had been his closest friend, a brother in arms whose laughter he could still hear in quiet moments. That friend had fallen, but in standing here, in holding this post without falter, he honored him, carried him forward, and kept his memory alive. A small note, tucked inside his uniform pocket, reminded him of another kind of sacrifice. It was from his mother, written decades ago, urging him to be brave, to hold on to honor even when the world demanded compromise. He pressed it lightly against his chest, the paper warm from the heat of his hand, and felt the weight of history, family, and duty all converge in that single, quiet heartbeat. Medals and commendations meant little here. The recognition of the public, the flashing cameras, the whispered "are they" were fleeting. What mattered was the silence of the tomb, the solemn gaze of the unknown soldiers resting nearby, the sacred promise he had made long before anyone else arrived, to stand, to honor, to endure. Every step he had taken since returning from war, every long hour of training, every sacrifice, had prepared him for this moment. The day slowly wound down. Tourists walked past, some noticing the guard, some unaware of what had just unfolded. The air held a sense of reverence, a collective understanding that something extraordinary had occurred. The crowd, though dispersed, carried the story with them. Some would tell their children, some would post online, some would reflect quietly at home. And the guard, unwavering, remained at his post, a sentinel of discipline, an embodiment of the lesson that courage is often silent, and strength is often still. As the sun dipped lower, painting the marble in gold, the guard allowed himself a small breath, a momentary pause in the endless rhythm of duty. He thought of the child who had whispered "hero," of the colonel's quiet nod of respect, of the fallen friends whose memories he bore. He understood that heroism did not require action alone. It required endurance, patience, and an unshakable commitment to principle. And in that quiet epilogue, with the world moving around him but not touching him, he found peace. He had not been tested by chance alone. He had been tested by will, by chaos, by the desire of another to impose fear. And he had stood firm for the tomb, for the fallen, for the future, and for the ideals that shaped him. He remained unbroken. The sun had nearly set over Arlington, casting long golden shadows across the tomb of the unknown soldier. The air was calm now, carrying only the quiet hum of distant footsteps and whispered conversations. What had begun as chaos, a threat to the sacred ground, had ended in a lesson written not with words, but with stillness, discipline, and unwavering courage. The guard remained at his post, every line of his uniform, every inch of his stance a testament to years of training and sacrifice. Around him, the crowd had thinned, leaving only the weight of history and the solemn presence of those who had come before. And though cameras no longer clicked, though the commotion had faded, the impact lingered. What the world had witnessed was more than a confrontation. It was a lesson in what true strength looks like. Quiet, steadfast, unyielding. Tradition is not weakness, a voice might have whispered among the stones. Stillness is strength. The guard had embodied that truth, showing that courage is not always loud, heroism does not always demand action, and honor is most powerful when it is unwavering, even in the face of fear and provocation. The moment would echo not just in the minds of those present, but across screens, through stories, and in the hearts of anyone who sought to understand what it truly means to stand firm. And so, as the day ended, the guard remained, a sentinel against chaos, a living symbol of discipline over disorder. For the children who had watched, the veterans who had nodded in respect, and the countless strangers who would share the story far beyond Arlington. He had proven that sometimes the greatest victories are won without raising a hand. The world had seen courage in its purest form, and now it was time to carry the lesson forward. Stand firm, honor the past, respect the present, and never underestimate the power of quiet strength. If this story inspired you, share it, honor it, and remember the heroes who stand silently among us. Subscribe to follow more moments of courage, legacy, and the stories that remind us what it truly means to be steadfast.